Downtown Waco is much different from the downtown Waco of days gone by. There was a time when virtually all the retail stores and theaters in town were located here. Austin Avenue was the busiest street in town. It was Waco's main street. In recent years, it's been dressed up with trees, decorative lampposts, and brick paving. The improvements reflect the city's pride in its downtown and in this grand old thoroughfare. The fact that downtown Waco has changed is not especially unique, but the suddenness with which those changes were set in motion is without parallel in Texas history. This memorial marker is located at the corner of 5th and Austin Streets. It stands where a vicious tornado dealt its most crushing blow. It was a devastating tragedy. Many people lived through the storm. They remember well that fateful day. One of those is Tommy Suits. He was a commercial artist working in downtown Waco. Tommy was near the center of the storm and experienced the terror of those brief moments. Jimmy Willis was a freelance photographer at the time. He came downtown with his camera immediately after the tornado. Most of the scenes in this video were shot by Jimmy and his good friend and fellow photographer, Wendy Drum. Harry Province was the editor of the Waco Times-Herald and the Waco News Tribune. He and his staff had published the evening edition just shortly before tragedy struck. They have met downtown to begin this video project.
After looking at your pictures, Jimmy, of the destruction down here by the tornado in 1953, it's just still hard to believe that they could make this place look like it does now. It doesn't look anything like it used to. If it weren't for that marker on the corner, Jimmy, nobody could prove that there was a tornado down there. There's just no sign of it.
Harry, the marker was put up by the family of William Watkins, one of the R.T. Dennis employees who was killed in the wreckage of the store.
He was one of the 22 people killed in the Dennis building when it collapsed.
That was a terrible day. And it was made more terrible by the fact that there were so many people downtown in those days. This was the heart of Waco, where everything happened.
The Waco of yesteryear, a quiet city of 85,000 that absolutely depended on its downtown district for everything. Clothing, jewelry, drugstores, furniture stores, banks, city and county government offices, all the movies, all the sports. If it was in town, it was downtown. Austin Avenue was the main drag through town, and the corner of Austin and 5th Streets was largely the center of activity. During World War II, graduating cadets from the air base usually marched in review down Austin Avenue, proudly showing their newly acquired airman's wings. All of us had heard for generations back the old Indian legend that a tornado could never strike Waco. It was supposed to be protected by the hills north and west and south of downtown. Well, so much for the old Indian legend. The R.T. Dennis furniture store looked big and solid on this corner for 3 generations. Down on the next corner at Franklin and 5th, the old Tom Paget building stood where it had been since 1890, and it looked good for another 60 years. Tom Paget's saddle and harness factory had long since vanished into history. The Paget Company had been converted to cameras and sporting goods and had moved to the corner of 9th and Austin Avenue. In the old Paget building in 1953 was the Neely Paint Store, but the most of the huge interior served as a warehouse for the Dennis Furniture Company. It's hard to realize today that this was a busy farmer and merchant trading center for over 100 years. Like most county seats in Texas, Waco had a city square. City Hall, rather than the courthouse, was the centerpiece. The old City Hall, built about 1880, finally wasn't big enough, so in 1927 they built the City Hall we have today. By that time, the automobile had replaced the horses and mules, but the stores and cafes and taverns on the square kept busy until May the 11th, 1953. Another landmark disappeared that day, historic Katy Park. Waco had had Texas League baseball teams for 35 years, the Navigators, the Waco Cubs, then the semi-pro Dons, and during World War II, the greatest baseball team that ever played in Waco, a collection of major league stars representing the Waco Army Airfield. Finally, there were the Waco Pirates of the big state league, and the Pirates had to move to Longview when Katy Park was destroyed. Teddy Roosevelt had made a speech in old Katy Park way back in the early 1900s. Babe Ruth drew an overflow crowd for an exhibition game back in the 20s. It was truly a setting for many exciting events over a half-century. Downtown Waco was a busy place on May the 11th, 1953. A lot of people were here, shopping, dining out, taking care of business, seeing a movie. It was a Monday and not a pretty day. The sky was dark throughout the day and the rain fell continually. The weather reports on the previous day hadn't promised a quick end to the rainy conditions. Here's the weather map for May the 10th, 1953. See the indication that a massive cold front stretching from Canada to Mexico was moving into the warm air of the plains. Ironically, 6 Waco people were killed by a tornado on May the 10th, 1953, near Hollandale, Minnesota. The Martinez family had gone north to work in the asparagus fields. A tornado out of that cold front blew them out of their shack and into a muddy field. All of them were killed. Our page 1 of the Waco Times-Herald for May the 11th told the story. Mrs. Mary Vasquez, grandmother of the Martinez children, is shown as she tells our reporter of her grief. That issue of the Times-Herald was printed only 4 hours before our town blew away. In it, we quoted a local weather forecaster, Mr. C.A. Anderson. According to him, there was no likelihood of a tornado in Waco. About an hour and a half after we went to press, a tornado struck San Angelo, 200 miles to our west. It killed 8 people, wrecked many homes, and demolished an elementary school building. That storm front was moving toward us in a big way. However, at 4:30 p.m., a Waco radio broadcast assured listeners that there was no danger of a tornado in Waco. At that very moment, the tornado was chewing up houses and barns in Lorena and Hewitt, and it was barreling into the city limits of Waco. Rain and hail fell heavily in most parts of Waco, including the downtown section. It was getting darker and darker, and the wind was rising. And in a matter of a very few minutes, this massive storm laid waste to a 2-square-mile area through the very heart of Waco. It was calculated later that the storm moved through it at 36 miles an hour, and that its tornadic winds reached an estimated 500 miles an hour. It was said that the storm produced a severe vacuum that caused some buildings to explode and collapse. Others were simply blown down by the terrible force of the wind. The map shows the main path of the storm. Actually, its trail of destruction extended for 23 miles, from Lorena to Billington on the edge of Limestone County. These photos, made by Wayne Farmer Jr. of Houston, show what happened to houses on Bells Hill in the vicinity of the elementary school on Cleveland Avenue. They were the first of a total of 850 residences in South Waco and East Waco that suffered heavily in the tornado's force. Onward roared the tornado into the edge of downtown Waco. For years, the Olympic-sized sun pool had been a popular spot for swimmers and swimming contests. At the edge of the sun pool was the last vestige of the old Cotton Palace Coliseum, a high wall that held the stage curtains. The swimming season had not begun on May the 11th, so the pool was empty. As the storm approached, a half a dozen teenage boys dived for shelter in the dressing room beneath that high stone wall. The storm hit, and down came the wall in huge chunks. The dressing room was buried. 4 of the boys dug themselves out, scratched up but safe, but 2 others, Billy Batrus and Stan Skiles, were crushed to death. It took hours to bring up their bodies. In another minute, there were other bodies, in buildings and in cars and along the streets. Men and women perished under tons of rubble. The Douglas manufacturing plant at 10th and Webster lost most of its roof and its front brick wall. By a quirk of fate, none of the Douglas workers was injured. Their workday was over and they were ready to punch out and depart for the day, but they were held up momentarily by their time clock. It was running a minute slow. That 1-minute delay saved them from being struck by the falling debris outside. Next was Katy Park on Jackson between 7th and 8th. It was left in ruins. Notice the sign on the ruins, soda 10 cents. Buster Chatham, manager of the Waco Pirates baseball team, and a player, Jack Berger, ran from the office when the grandstand began to collapse. They dived underneath the Katy switch engine that was standing beside the ballpark office. Buster said he'd complained for weeks about the engine being parked there, but he was sure glad to see it, and it saved their lives. 2 blocks farther on, the steeple of the First Methodist Church crashed to the ground. The church roof went skyward. This scene reveals the destruction of buildings on 5th Street between the two railroads, including the Shear Coffee Company, Davis Brothers Publishing Company, and several produce wholesalers. Across 5th Street at the Mary Avenue corner, the Dr. Pepper bottling plant lost its roof and a part of one wall. The nearby Cotton Belt Freight Depot took a hard hit, losing portions of the roof and wall. The old Cotton Belt passenger station at South 4th and Mary was totally destroyed. Now we come to the deadliest and best remembered blow of the Waco tornado. On the front of the Amicable building at 5th and Austin, the First National Bank clock shows 4:40 in the afternoon. Juanita Willis' picture established the time the tornado shut off all the downtown power and caused all this wreckage. Wayne Farmer Jr. was 4 blocks away at 9th and Austin, working for Tom Paget Company at that location. When the storm darkened downtown Waco and began to blow away signs and show windows and vehicles, Farmer took a camera and started down Austin Avenue, still unable to see what had happened down the street. In Wayne Farmer's words, people were just terrified. They were out on the street now in doorways, just standing, total disbelief and shock on their faces, unquote. He photographed this woman wading storm waters at 8th and Austin. A Bauer McCann clerk is trying to rescue merchandise through a broken show window in this Wayne Farmer photograph. When he approached 5th and Austin, he saw the huge pile of debris that had been the Dennis building. The ornamental molding that once proudly adorned the edge of the Dennis building roof is seen lying in the street. Farmer stopped taking pictures long enough to call the Waco Fire Department at 12th and Columbus, asking for a rescue squad. They were not aware of the tornado and didn't grasp the situation. An assistant chief was sent to investigate. Farmer snapped this picture of the assistant chief's car parked at what was the Dennis building. The assistant chief is seen staring at the wreckage. No doubt his training had not prepared him for anything like this. Farmer said the deathly silence at that moment was broken only by a horn on one of the crushed autos that kept wailing until the battery failed. Farmer went into the Amicable building to seek a vantage point for more photographs. He reports that the stampede on the stairway by frightened men and women from the upper floors of the 22-story building almost knocked him down. The workers reported that the upper stories of the Amicable building swayed so violently that desks slid from one wall to the other and the desk drawers flew open at the same time. The rain diminished but continued to fall softly on the shattered heart of Waco. The stunning devastation had not yet been attacked by rescuers. The same situation is shown in this Jimmy Willis photo of Franklin Avenue between 5th and 4th Streets, stunned onlookers, not yet galvanized into action. As the initial shock wore off, rescue efforts by the first onlookers began, and not long afterward, hundreds of volunteer workers attacked the wreckage. One of the most poignant tragedies of the Waco tornado had just occurred at Texas Seed Company on Franklin Avenue, midway between 4th and 5th Streets. W.J. Dobrovolny, accompanied by his daughter Gloria and her friend Barbara Johnson, had just driven downtown to buy seed for his parakeet. When they reached Texas Seed Company, he got out of the car and went into the store. The girls circled the block as the rain and hail beat down and the wind rose. They returned to the door of the Texas Seed Company and saw Mr. Dobrovolny motioning them to come inside out of the blowing storm. Barbara dashed into the store, and Gloria was about to follow when before her eyes the building collapsed and buried her father and friend. Gloria was unhurt. The bodies of the victims inside Texas Seed Company were not recovered for nearly 24 hours. In this Jimmy Willis photograph of 5th Street looking towards the Dennis wreckage and the Amicable building, the huge rooftop water tank that crashed down from the Dennis building in the alley lies on top of a Dennis janitor, Sam Haynes, one of 22 Dennis employees who died in the storm. Dr. Ernest Johnson's office was at the rear of the Paget building. In this photograph, we see Mrs. Johnson bending over the rubble that covered her husband. Dr. Johnson eventually was pulled to safety, cut and bruised, but not seriously injured. Less fortunate was Gussie Mayfield, his nurse of 25 years. She died beside him under the pile of bricks. His assistant, Ted Lucenay, his secretary, Mrs. Juanita Pitts, and 2 women patients all came out alive and not seriously injured. Across the street from the Paget building, a pickup lies on the sidewalk where the wind had picked it up and dropped it. Several other automobiles were buried under the Paget and Dennis wreckage, smashed down flat, with their occupants dead. You wouldn't think from looking that anybody could have come out of the Joy Theater alive. 100 or so people had been inside watching the movie. The ceiling fell on them, but fortunately it was lightweight material and caused no serious injury. As the roof of the building came crashing down, it hung up on a portion of the wall. This prevented it from crushing the people inside. They all came out alive, scratched and skinned up and scared to death, and feeling very lucky. A much more tragic story lay next door in the ruins of Chris's Cafe. 5 bodies under the rubble included 2 of the cafe's owners, Vic and Angelo Sermus. Several other patrons and workers survived the storm with injuries. The entrance to the Palace Recreation Hall shows the interior completely collapsed. 17 patrons perished amid the domino and pool tables of another club next door. Most of them were not extricated until the next day. City Hall is the only structure shown in this photo of pre-tornado Waco that still stands. All the buildings that once occupied City Hall Square fell victims of the storm. Today, the Hilton Hotel sits about where Bridge Street ran between City Hall and the Suspension Bridge. The Waco Convention Center complex fills in most of the north side of the square. The businesses that line 3rd Street in front of City Hall likewise vanished after the tornado. The wide open spaces today give no evidence that those once busy enterprises flourished between Franklin and Washington Avenues. The buildings around Waco's historic square suffered complete damage. Here are pictured the ruins along Bridge Street, the oldest street in Waco. The first 3-story building in Waco was one of the Bridge Street Casualties. Here, its top story is gone. It is evident that the sudden collapse of buildings meant that many persons were trapped and either killed or gravely injured. The death toll in this area, when it was finally possible to find all of the bodies, reached 38 persons. That many or more were hospitalized with severe injuries. The city farmers market on First Street behind the square was the tomb of several patrons, and many other persons suffered injuries when its concrete blocks started flying in the storm. Clifton Simpson hardware store on the north side of the square lost its awning and had much roof and water damage, but stood up to protect its workers. Several thousand baby chickens perished in the basement of the Waco Grain and Seed Company when its interior and roof fell in. The south side of the square suffered extensive damage, with the result that several lives were lost and many other persons injured. The front of the Gym Theater on the south side of the square collapsed soon after the rest of the building was gutted by the tornado. Every part of Old Waco, from the river to 3rd Street, suffered total destruction, as is evidenced by these scenes. Downtown Waco looked as though an air raid had struck it. Local veterans of World War II, viewing the destruction downtown, compared it to London during the Blitz and to German cities devastated by bombs and shells. One military officer said he'd never seen worse havoc in Europe than he saw in downtown Waco. East Waco suffered deaths and destruction as the tornado swept across its length. The wreckage of businesses along Elm Street, including Pioneer Welding Company and Empire Seed Company, shown here, illustrate the force of the storm. The last person to die from tornado injuries was an East Waco resident. Mr. C.J. Eschenberg suffered fatal injuries at his home at 625 Rose Street. He died on May 21st at Providence Hospital, number 114 on the roster of tornado dead. He was the only injured victim who died after reaching the hospital. The top story of the East Waco Elementary School blew away, and the remaining part of the structure took heavy damage. Fortunately, the pupils and teachers had departed before the storm struck. News of the Waco catastrophe spread swiftly. James Meredith, Civil Defense Director, Colonel Wiley Stem, commander of the local National Guard unit, the Texas Department of Public Safety, and James Connolly Air Force Base all went into action in a remarkably short time to start coping with the disaster. Meredith called on Texas Power and Light Company for portable generators. Colonel Stem's guardsmen brought other generators. The air base rushed in 100 military policemen and followed them with hundreds of airmen and medical personnel to assist in search and rescue efforts. The man in the officer's cap here is a French pilot trainee from Connolly. The Department of Public Safety rushed more than 30 state troopers to Waco on first news of the tornado. They assisted in rescue work, in traffic control, and in scouring the downtown wholesale centers for flashlights, tools, and other necessities for the search and rescue operations. Spectators flocked to the scene so thickly that Sheriff C.C. Maxey and Police Chief Jesse Gunterman used loudspeakers to urge the people to leave unless they were going to help dig into the rubble. Colonel Stem's troops were set on picket duty at 9th Street and on 5th Street and the southern edge of downtown to turn back all but those who would come to work. It was a very swift reaction from all of these elements with no prior rehearsal. Darkness and continuing rain didn't affect the frantic rescue work. Mayor Ralph Wolf and City Manager Jack Jeffrey found City Hall unfit to use with no windows and no electric power. They moved to the second floor of the Amicable building to set up a disaster control headquarters, for the Amicable had its own electricity and water and fuel supply. They operated there in the director's room of the First National Bank for more than a week, directing all the search and rescue workers and their equipment. Local contractors and the airbase furnished cranes, bulldozers, front-end loaders, and scores upon scores of trucks to attack the mountain of wreckage downtown. Fort Hood and Camp Walters at Mineral Wells started their heavy machinery and troops toward Waco, and all of them found work. An armored engineer battalion from Fort Hood bivouacked at Baylor Stadium. The heavy equipment of that unit was fully occupied downtown. Waco's doctors and nurses hurried to Providence Hospital and to Hillcrest Hospital, and as they arrived, the first injured victims of the storm came in by ambulance and private automobile. Most of the physicians and surgeons had been through World War II military medical duties, and they knew plenty about handling emergencies. They formed teams at the hospitals to sort out the injured persons for appropriate treatment and to give that treatment quickly and well, so well that only one injured victim died after reaching the hospital. Most of the physicians and surgeons and nurses worked steadily until Tuesday morning and continued to be on duty for the rest of the week as needed. The Air Base Hospital handled an overflow of more than 40 patients, and the Veterans Hospital also took care of a few. The doctors refused payments for their services. They collected a fund from insurance settlements that was turned over to the Waco Disaster Fund. In the same spirit, ambulance drivers and ambulance companies donated all of their services. The Red Cross Regional Blood Bank on North 18th Street had been in operation only a year. It received hundreds of volunteer blood donors starting early in the evening and continuing through the rest of that week to provide blood needed in the hospitals. All night long, the rain continued to fall lightly. This was a fortunate thing because it prevented fires. Gradually, with great effort, the living and the dead were taken out of the R.T. Dennis building. Here we see 4 rescuers finding and extricating a woman from the Dennis debris. This painstaking search continued to yield bodies, some of them alive, as we see in these pictures. From the instant the Dennis building collapsed until 9:30 that evening, nobody knew that Miss Lily Matkin, the Dennis switchboard operator, lay trapped under 15 feet of wreckage. Finally, her faint cries were heard, and Miss Matkin tells of her ordeal.
And found that I was trapped, though I couldn't move, only my right arm, and I was so crumpled up that I don't suppose I was more than 2 feet long. Then I started screaming for help, help.
Rescuers were pulling away the debris piece by piece.
I could hear them talking, but they couldn't hear me, and then I'd start praying. And then I'd just be perfectly calm, and I was getting enough air for the wind on the outside. And then finally I could hear them so close by, and I knew they were, then the fact they said they were looking for someone else now. Well, then I just started screaming for help.
An airman from the airbase finally caught a glimpse of Miss Matkin in the beam of his flashlight.
He said, "Can you see this light?" And I said, "Yes." And I put my hand out, and he said, "Oh, I can see her hand moving."
The rescuers carefully began to try to reach Miss Matkin, hour after hour. About 2:30 in the morning, they realized that the slightest jolt to the wreckage above her would bring it all down and crush her. So all heavy equipment around the Dennis wreckage was halted, and the delicate removal continued.
And they started working. They cut all my air off. It was such a crowd, you know. And then, from then on, the 2 air corpsmen kept me with oxygen until they took me out to put me in the ambulance.
It was 6:55 a.m. Tuesday when Miss Matkin was finally pulled from the wreckage. She'd been buried for more than 14 hours. Dr. Aubrey Goodman, who'd stayed on duty all night, gave her a relaxant, and she was whisked to the hospital. She had a black eye, bruises and lacerations, but no broken bones. She was the last survivor to be found, but the search for more bodies went on for 5 more days. So strenuous was the work that from time to time a rescue worker would collapse from exhaustion. We see here a husband and wife team from the air base. Airman Byron Bowers is being given oxygen by his wife, who was standing by to assist. It was slow going. By midnight of May 11, they had found 37 bodies. By 1:30 the next afternoon, they had found 61 bodies. Holman Easley aimed his 8mm camera out of a window in the Amicable building. His movies graphically show the search for more victims at 5th and Austin and 5th and Franklin. Heavy machinery of all kinds and scores upon scores of workers patiently dismantled the ruins. Searchers continued to find more bodies of men and women. Ambulances lined up on 5th Street to receive the remains and take them to the mortuaries. 24 embalmers came from all over Texas to assist in this grim aftermath of the Waco tornado. There were 22 persons killed in the Dennis building, including Rush Berry and his son Ed Berry, who were the managers of the store. 4 others died in the Paget building, and 17 more in the Domino and Pool Hall next door. 5 bodies came out of Chris Cafe. The total dead in this block stood at 56 persons when the final bricks were taken away. It wasn't until May the 15th that they found the last of the bodies in the ruins, to bring the total to 113 persons dead. As we've already noted, the 114th victim died in the hospital a week later. The torrential rain that preceded the storm was only a prelude to the downpours that followed on Tuesday, a total of 11 inches of steady rain. The poor drainage in East Waco created lakes on streets and in open spaces, as these pictures show. Electric power lines went down on both sides of the Brazos River. Downtown from 9th Street to the river was without electric service for a week after the storm. Texas Power and Light Company brought in hundreds of additional linemen and other repair specialists to restore service in East Waco and downtown. Not only had the wires snapped and in some cases disappeared, but the transformers weighing 1,300 pounds each flew through the air and landed blocks from their original locations, another sign of the violent power in the Waco tornado. Southwestern Bell also imported hundreds of repair workers to restore its downtown lines, and Lone Star Gas Company had its share of repair problems following the breaking of lines in downtown buildings. These views of Grayson's and Cinderella shops at 7th and Austin illustrate the power of the vacuum created by the Waco tornado. The insides were literally sucked out of those stores. Across the street at 7th and Austin, the same fate befell McCrory's variety store as this photo shows. Mr. C.J. Ott was the manager of McCrory's store. Mr. Ott worked until 3 o'clock Tuesday morning helping to clean up the wreckage. He went home and promptly died of a heart attack. In actuality, Mr. Ott should be counted as a victim of the storm, and if he were so listed, the total death toll would be 115 persons, not 114. This view of 3rd Street between Austin Avenue and Franklin Avenue shows what the tornado did on that historic site. This ornate 2-story building was occupied by the first bank founded in Waco. Bankers Alley ran alongside, connecting to 4th Street. Follow the eye of the camera down 3rd to Franklin, a row of gutted stores and shops. At the corner of Franklin, more destruction. And across that corner, still more ruins, all the way back up to where the square began. The show windows at Montgomery Ward's big store at 4th and Austin Avenue received rough treatment from the storm. The clothing dummies sprawled inside and in the street after the storm passed by. A rooftop water tank fell through the store to the basement, and the rains which followed drenched everything in the store. Here's how Montgomery Ward hung its wet merchandise out to dry once the clear skies had come back. The manager of that store took the lead in rounding up work gloves from all parts of Waco and from stores in nearby towns because the rescue workers were wearing out gloves faster than he could replace them from his own stock. This row of shops on South 8th at the corner with Jackson Street indicates the wide-ranging reach of the Waco tornado. Another victim on South 8th Street was Thomason's drugstore, shown here with its sign replaced upside down to barricade the blown-out door and show windows. The tornado played havoc with automobiles in downtown Waco that terrible afternoon. The stories of how the twister hurled cars and trucks about are memorable indeed. For example, a truck driver from West Texas was at the wheel when his pickup was lifted higher than 5 stories above the street and then set down undamaged. A bus driver coming down Austin Avenue saw another pickup sailing along 6 feet off the ground. Parked cars in the vicinity of the Dennis and Paget buildings were crushed. In one of these, shown here, Professor Keith James and his wife were killed. A total of 9 persons, including the James couple, perished in their cars. Other occupants suffered severe injuries but survived. In the process of clearing away the wreckage of the storm, damaged autos were piled on vacant lots and finally taken to storage yards on the edge of town. It's estimated that 2,000 automobiles were destroyed or put out of action by the Waco tornado. When the toll in human suffering was added up, there were 276 major injuries, most of them fractures and severe lacerations, 947 minor injuries, a lot of them from splintered plate glass, and 114 persons dead. It was the deadliest tornado in Texas history. The mournful task of burying the dead went on for days after the storm. Typical of the aftermath is this scene of a multiple burial at Waco Memorial Park. By a strange turn of fate, there were no natural deaths in Waco for 4 days after the tornado. This alleviated the burden on local mortuaries. Waco's disaster caught the sympathies of the American people. From every major city in Texas and from all of Waco's Central Texas neighbors, gifts of money and medicine and clothing and food poured into Waco. The Red Cross rushed a disaster team to begin restoring families and their possessions. The Red Cross also paid hospital and medical bills running into the thousands of dollars. Nearly 1,000 families found the Red Cross a prompt source of help. Before it was all over, the Red Cross had spent almost $400,000 on Waco tornado relief. The Salvation Army had 3 mobile canteens in operation around the downtown rescue sites within an hour after the storm, and the Salvation Army dispensed mountains of clothing and food to distressed Waco families for the rest of that month. Families whose homes were blown away by the tornadoes found shelter in various church and school buildings. Here we see Mrs. R.F. White and her 3 children being shown to their temporary quarters at the Austin Avenue Methodist Church by a Red Cross relief worker. Donations of clothing came in such volume that the Red Cross and Salvation Army had to use the Heart of Texas Coliseum to store the garments, as this photo illustrates. Waco's Boy Scout troops rallied quickly to the need for volunteers in the downtown disaster area. Some of the Explorer troops had basic training in disaster work. They got to practice their skills and to learn some new ones in the hectic aftermath of the storm. As donations continued to arrive, Waco business leaders created the Waco Disaster Fund in consultation with the Red Cross. This fund ultimately dispensed nearly $400,000 itself in restoring homes and businesses for Waco storm victims. Its remainder went to defray college expenses for orphans of the storm. Harlan Fentress, the publisher of the Waco daily newspapers, served as chairman of the Waco Disaster Fund, along with Walter Lacey Jr., Howard Hamilton, and Winthrop Seeley. This picture shows George Walter on the right, manager of Owens, Illinois' glass factory, giving a check for $10,000 to Howard Hamilton for the Waco Disaster Fund. It was typical of the way tornado relief money poured into the stricken city from all over the United States. Federal civil defense money and federal disaster loans also contributed substantially to Waco's task of rebuilding the streets and utilities and clearing away the mountains of wreckage. Every person who digs into the events of May 11th, 1953 and the weeks that followed will find repeated references to the total unselfishness and the willingness to go far beyond the call of duty on the part of those who worked in the ruins, who worked in the hospitals, who worked in the relief stations and in the shattered neighborhoods. Eddie Weems, who was one of the reporters on the scene and who wrote the book entitled Tornado, commented on the rush of generosity he observed on all sides in storm-torn Waco. Weems wrote, quote, "People helped each other in countless ways. That week can be called a human triumph," unquote. This spirit continued to make itself felt for weeks and months after the tornado. An Assembly of God church in East Waco built a home in one day for one of its members whose residence had been destroyed. Another group did the same thing for a homeless family on Bell's Hill. And the Red Cross and Waco Disaster Fund paid medical bills for injured storm victims for years afterward. The task of cleanup went on. Buildings that had housed thriving businesses only days before were hauled away as trash. A policeman stationed at the intersection of Austin and 5th Streets stares at the vacant lot on the corner. Only a short time before, it had been occupied by the R.T. Dennis Furniture Building. As the cleanup was being completed, the business of addressing the future was already underway. People always seem to have the capacity to rise above adversity, no matter how difficult the circumstance, and that was certainly true of the people of Waco. Not only did they meet the challenge of immediate cleanup from the storm's devastation, but as the years went on, they achieved new levels of community pride and progress. Through persistent cooperation with public and private leadership, Wacoans created the amenities we see today in all parts of the city. An urban renewal program cleared away most remnants of the tornado's devastation. It also made possible a vital expansion of the Baylor University campus, and it provided major public housing for many families. A new and much larger Lake Waco assures Waco's water supply far into the future. A beautiful community college campus grew up in North Waco. The state's first technical college at the former Air Force Base gives Waco a priceless asset in job training and a growing aerospace industry. The banks of the Brazos River through Waco are being beautified for the enjoyment of all citizens. All of these and many more achievements of community pride and courage continue to make Waco a great place for quality living. Memories of the disaster of May the 11th, 1953 serve to remind us how far we've come since that fateful day. History owes a large debt to the talented photographers whose work in the aftermath of the Waco tornado made this videotape possible. Even more importantly, their work at the time told the world of Waco's disaster. Photographs by Jimmy and Juanita Willis, by Wendy Drum, by Wayne Farmer Jr., and by Bill Cagle were printed in newspapers across America, as well as in Life magazine and other news weeklies. Jimmy and Juanita Willis were a notable team in photography in Waco for 40 years. On the afternoon of May 11, 1953, Jimmy was installing a TV antenna at their home and studio at 26th and Washington. The hailstorm with ice cube-sized stones drove him indoors. He learned of the downtown storm from his police band radio and raced to the scene. Juanita Willis was in process of photographing Miss Sandra Witt for a portrait when she received a phone call about the tornado. She too raced away to the scene. Interestingly enough, the negative of Miss Sandra Witt was not found by the Willises for 38 years. Once it turned up, Jimmy made a print of the portrait and took it to Sandra Witt, who is now Mrs. Jack Birch, and she was happy to finally receive it. Wendy Drum, one of Waco's most talented photographers, seemed to be everywhere after the storm, from Bells Hill to East Waco, from downtown to the Coliseum, and all the way back. Since his death, Wendy Drum's negatives are held by Jim Jasek, who graciously made them, along with some of his own photography, available for this record. Bill Cagle was in his car downtown when the storm struck. He was unhurt and immediately began to take photographs of the first stages of the search and rescue. Holman Easley, a top executive at Amicable Life Insurance Company, found his office window a fine place from which to aim his 8mm movie camera. Wayne Farmer Jr. used his ideal location at 9th and Austin to take the very first photographs at 5th and Austin after the storm passed. His father, Wayne Farmer Sr., was also a photographer who not only made pictures of the storm, but developed and printed their pictures in his studio. The father died years ago. Wayne Jr. lives in Houston. Mr. Al Grauer was employed at Texas Farm Bureau office at 114 South 5th Street and was there when the storm struck. He was not injured, and the building only lost its front window. Mr. Grauer used an 8mm camera to record scenes of search and rescue after the storm. Tommy Suits, a veteran commercial artist and photographer, rode out the storm at Austin Engraving Company on South 6th Street. He remembers diving under a large table when the storm roared overhead. He watched a large book float across the room in the vacuum from the twister. Tommy Suits provided graphic artwork and valuable counsel in the preparation of this video. To all of these fine photographers, we say a heartfelt thank you very much indeed.